Hello, everybody, and welcome. In this next video, I'm about to show you guys how to build out your enemy AI. And this is going to be continuing the visual scripting platformer tutorial that we've been working on for the last several videos now. And this will most likely be the most comprehensive and the most complex section of the entire series. So just be aware, this video will probably be significantly longer than some of the others. I'll try and section it up, but this is just going to be kind of a lengthy one. So just be aware of that as we move forward, and watch through this first. Just kind of watch as I do. Try and listen to what I'm saying, kind of how I'm trying to explain some of the context for the scripts and the kind of mechanics that we'll be developing. And don't hesitate to take notes. You'll always be able to reference this video, but take notes the first time you watch through it, and just see if you can kind of try to really absorb what's going on before you start digging into developing in Unity. So without further ado, I will share my screen. And I have my player in level 1 from my platformer. So what I'm actually going to do is go to my scenes and go to level 3. This is the first level where we have an enemy. There we go. And we have this little red enemy, kind of similar to a Goomba from Mario, except he's got a little spike on his head. It's kind of maybe a little hard to see that. We can see a little bit better if we zoom in. Now, what we'll be first doing is similar to our player help. I'll select my enemy, and I will add a component. And I'm going to call this a state machine. Now, I already have state in here from when I added the state machine component to my player. So I'm going to choose state machine. And what I'm going to do is hit new on this button. Now I can also alternatively go to my macros and right click and create visual scripting and state graph. Make sure you choose state graph. I can do this, and we will call this enemy, just enemy. So just like our player help, we will be bunkering and storing all of our enemies' kind of mechanics and developmental kind of like graphs within this whole state machine. So if I go back to my enemy, I can click over here. I'll hit this little circle icon instead of hitting new now, because I've already made this. And then I have 2 state machines that I can choose from, enemy and player help. I'm going to choose enemy. And I'll exit out of here. And we should be good to go. Now, just like when I add a regular script machine, I should have my variables tab. There's nothing in here now, but we'll be populating this shortly. So I can edit my graph one of 2 ways, by choosing my enemy graph here and double clicking it, or just hitting the edit graph button in the inspector. So I'm going to hit edit graph. Should populate my state graph here in my script kind of graph tab. And if I open this up by double clicking in the window in here, you'll see that it is big and empty. There's nothing in here just yet, right? So what I'm going to do is right click, and I'm going to create a, what am I going to do? I am going to create a super state in this case, and I'm going to call this alive. Now, if I just look at this, I'll see it just says start, and I have this little green tab. This means it's activated or it's set up on start. What I can do to change the name of this, though, is just go up here in the graph inspector and hit where it says start, and I'll type in alive, and we see that it has now changed this title to alive. Now I'm going to want to make one more super state. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to do actually just a script state. There we go. And this is going to be my dead state. So just like my alive state, my super state here, with my script state, I'm going to go to the top left in my graph inspector, just title this dead. So this will be my alive and dead states for my enemy. Now, once the enemy is dead, it will not be able to transition to alive. But when it's alive, it will be able to transition to dead. So what I'm going to do is, with this alive state selected, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to make transition. I'm just going to go down and click on my dead state. I'll see that it highlights, and I'll click, and now I have a transition here. Now, I'm not going to work on this just now. I'm just kind of like getting everything broadly set up, and then I'll come back and work on these transitions. So in alive, I'm going to double click in here, and I will open up this state. By default, you'll see start. We don't need that off the top of the, just like off the top. So what I'm going to do is actually just delete that. And I'm going to create a few more states similar to what I just did with alive and dead. I'm going to right click and I'm going to create another super state. And this one's going to be called patrol. I'm going to go up to the start and I'm just going to title this patrol. Okay. Now from here, I'm going to create one more state. I'm going to call it damage. And I'm going to right click. It's going to be a script state. And I'm just going to title it damage. So this is when the player or when the enemy damages the player. And then I'm going to choose a chase state. So I'm going to do the same exact thing. Right click, create script state. And then I'm going to name this chase and hit enter. There we go. So I have one state that has this little green bar. It means it's toggled to start. And if I right click, I can change this toggle start and I can turn it off so it doesn't start immediately. But in this case, I want my patrol. So I'm going to right click and hit toggle start. I want my patrol and my damage states to be on at the start. So I'm going to right click damage and I'm going to toggle start as well. So by default, your first state should be toggle started. So you should see this green bar. If you don't, you just want to make sure that patrol and damage have these green bars and are active at start. Now, the next thing I'm going to want to do is create transitions between my patrol and chase state. Again, I'm not going to fill these in just yet, but we will shortly. So when my enemy is patrolling, my enemy will go left and right and it will idle on platforms when it's, not chasing the player. So if the player is not nearby, my enemy will just walk around and it will stop at random intervals. Now, when the player gets close to the enemy, we will go from a patrol, the enemy will go from patrolling to chasing the player. Now, if the player goes far enough away from the enemy will go from chase to then patrolling again. So I'm going to make a transition from patrol. So again, right click, make transition to chase. And now I'm going to make a transition from chase to patrol. I'm going to right click on the chase node, hit make transition, and go to patrol. So again, I'm not going to fill in these nodes just yet, but this is enough to get us started. Now, whenever the first state that I'm really going to want to dig into is going to be damage because that one's going to be pretty easy to create. I'm going to hit damage, double click on it to open this up. And just like my player health, if I look in the top left, I have this breadcrumb up here. So I can go back to the alive state by clicking up there. I can go back to the enemy state that this is all nested under. And this is kind of the top state, alive and dead. So again, just to help show you navigating this can be a little confusing. I'm going to go back into alive. I'm going to go back to damage. And now what I'm actually going to do is delete all three of these. I don't need either one of these for my damage state. I'm going to right click and I'm going to type in on collision with, and I have my on collision with graph from earlier. This is going to work perfect. I'm just going to type in player as my tag. So I'll be searching anything that collides with the enemy or this object that is tagged player will have a certain action called. In this case, we're going from target. And this action is going to be a custom event, and it's going to be a triggered custom event. And this event is going to be called damage. And the object that's receiving this damage is going to be the player. So we're going to tag this. And then we're going to add actually one argument for our trigger. And this argument is going to be an integer. Type in int. It's going to be int literal, and we're going to give it a value of 1. That means the character or the player will take damage for the amount of a 1, like 1 damage per damage with the enemy. So that is really our damage for our character or for our enemy. So we'll go back to our live state using this kind of these breadcrumbs at the top. So I'll hit alive. And now we are back over here. So now what I should be able to do is test my game. Now my player or my enemy won't be walking yet, but they should be taking or doing damage to the player when they collide. So let's see. Okay, I can walk back and forth. Let's see what happens when I run into the enemy. Oh, nothing is happening. Okay, so let's see what is going on here. Let's check my notes. Okay, so I went back and checked what I was having issues with, and it looks like I did not go back into level 1 and override my changes. So if you're having issues when you go to level 3, make sure you've done that first. So again, I'm in level 1. Make sure you click on your player. The player health that's been added, you want to make sure you go to overrides and apply all. Now, I already clicked the button. It's working now, but just make sure you're weary of that. So I'm going to go to level 3, and we're going to check to make sure our player is, in fact, taking damage and the appropriate amount whenever they run into the enemy. Okay, so let's bump into them. There we go. And it looks like I'm taking damage. Now, another thing you might want to check if you're noticing that your player isn't colliding properly or isn't interacting quite right with your enemy, you want to double check your layers. Now, we discussed this in one of the previous videos, but you want to go up to Edit, Project Settings, and you should go down to Physics 2D and scroll down. Now, all of mine are completely checked, and so this is an issue. What you want to check is where your enemies and your player invincible meet, and you want to uncheck that box. Now, there might be 2 instances of this depending on how this all works out, but I think this is the only one for me. So for now, that's the only one that I'm going to change. And this just guarantees that the player cannot interact and push the enemy whenever they are in the kind of invulnerable state. So I just uncheck that box. I'm going to play through it, and we'll just see what that looks like now. There we go. So it's still working as it should, but just be wary. Sometimes those physics settings can kind of be a little funky. If you have issues, just let me know. Okay, so now we have our enemy causing damage. So now what we need to do is set them up to walk around the space. So the way we do that is we will click on our enemy. Ooh, there we go. I'm going to go to my state graph tab, and we are going to open up the alive submenu again, or state. And from here, we're actually, I'm actually going to start by going to my project, and I'm not going to start in my macro or in my, enemy state. I'm going to create a brand new script. So I'm going to right click in my macros, go to create, visual scripting, and this is going to be a script graph. We're going to call this enemy walk. So this will just determine how our enemy will walk. So to get this started, what I'm going to do is double click on my script. And then I'm just going to maximize my window, and I'm going to start calling our walk animation for our enemy. Now, this is going to be a lot similar to how we set up our walk for our player, just minorly different. So this is going to be more automated and less using input. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to choose on update or just update. There we go. And I'm going to connect this to a set variable. And this is going to be a graph variable. And we're going to call this movement. And this is a variable that will only exist within our script, and we won't be pulling it or adjusting it in outside value. So we won't be entering a value. We'll just be collecting this and using this information for later. It's a point of data. Now we're going to take from our movement, we're going to get a new value, and we're going to get this by multiplying. And I'm going to use multiply. I believe this needs to be math generic. And our a value, we're going to get a variable, and we're going to call this a speed variable. I'm going to use an object variable, and we're going to call this variable speed. And I'm going to set this for the speed of our enemy. So our player speed is 3. We want our enemy to be just a little bit slower. So what I'm going to do is I need to make sure, one, that my enemy is selected. I can tell that it is not because I don't have an object menu here. So I'm just going to minimize my script menu. I'm going to select my enemy. And I can do this one of two ways. In the variables tab over here in my inspector for the enemy, I can add my speed there, or I can do this in the object panel of my Blackboard. Either way, you'll notice that it adds it to both. So I'm going to type in speed, make sure this is spelled the same way. So with a capital S, I'm going to hit this plus button, and this is going to be a float value. We're going to give this a value of 2 for now. And notice how that whenever I made that in the inspector here, it also shows it in my objects in the Blackboard. Okay, so I'm going to go back into the state graph, into alive, into put, oh, sorry, actually, no, I'm not. I'm getting confused, ahead of myself. I'm going back to the enemy walk script. Remember, this is a separate script. We haven't attached this to the enemy just yet. Just double click on that. All right, and we'll get back to setting this up. Okay, so from here, I'm going to multiply my speed value, excuse me, with a normalized direction value. So I'm going to go normalize. And for this, we're going to be adding an input. Now, right now, I do not have really an input that I can put in. So if I hit add node and type in input, this is the one that I need. But notice how there's no plug here, or there's no hook. So to set this up, what I'm going to have to do is first, well, let's see. I'll need to add a direction value. Now, this is going to be through my data inputs. I'm going to go up here in my graph inspector. I'm going to hit this plus button. I'm going to call this direction. There you go. And this is going to be of type float. And notice how when I come down here, it didn't save my direction. There we go. Enter. Okay. And this is going to have a default value, and I'm just going to leave it at 0 for now. Okay. So now I can link this up to my normalized value. So what this is going to say is what normalized does is it creates a 1 or 0, essentially, value for whatever input my direction is. So is it a negative or positive, or is it going to be, whether it's negative or positive, it's going to be a positive value afterwards. So we're essentially checking, are we moving in any direction or no direction at all? If we are idle, then our direction is going to be 0. But if we're moving to the left, we're going to have a value of a negative number. And if we're moving to the right, we're going to have a value of a positive number. But either way, that number is going to be a 0 or not 0. And that's what normalized does. So if our speed, if we have a direction, if we're going a certain way, that will give us a 1 value for normalize, and then we'll take our speed and multiply that by 1, and that gives us our movement speed. Whereas if our character is not moving, then our direction will be 0, and we're essentially multiplying speed by 0 for our movement value. So we have no movement there. What this effectively does is calculates our direction and movement. So I'm going to group this up and just call this calculate direction and movement. There we go. Now from here, what we need to do is determine how our character flips. So our sprites should be turning left or turning right, depending on which direction the character is walking and which way they're supposed to be facing. So I'm going to go from my set variable tab. I'm going to go to if. Just type in an if statement. For that if statement value, I'm going to be measuring. I'm going to look for an equal value. And we're going to compare the value of A, which is we're going to link to our normalized value, to 0, or B. Now, I don't have a 0 in here because I'm using a different kind of equals. If I right click and replace and then hit equal, I can use, let's see, where is it? Oh, actually, if I select this equal, all I have to do is check this numeric box in the graph inspector. And now I can enter my own values for each kind of variable here. Okay, so if our normalized value equals 0, then what do we want to happen? Well, if false, we're going to set the local scale, which means just the scale of our character. We're going to take this bottom value and we're going to use a vector3 create. We're going to use individual values for our X, Y, and Z. And remember, with our player, we just kept Y and Z values as 1. So we're not shifting the size of our player. We're just shifting the X value. And again, this is going to be a negative or positive kind of value. So whether our player is negative in the negative value, then they'll be moving left. If they're in the positive value, they're moving right. Okay, so now we're checking for the flip, and we're flipping the character. So this is going to be the most of it. We're going to attach that if statement further down, but this is where we'll be checking to flip along the x-axis, depending, or along the y-axis, depending on our x value. So next, we have to set the velocity for our enemy. So to do this, we'll take our if true statement and we'll keep running this through. We'll send this to the rigid body of our enemy, in this case, a rigid body, and we're going to use set velocity. Okay. And we're actually going to take our set local scale to send this to, send through. And then from here, we're going to determine how we're going to set our rigid body. So we're going to be using a vector 2 in this case, and we're going to create one with x and y values. Our y value will be our current y value. And the reason we do this instead of something else is because our character might be jumping, or they might just be walking. They might be falling down a platform. So regardless of their y value, their current y value that we're creating should just continue to be what it is. I'm going to go to rigid body, 2D, and I'm actually going to get velocity on this one. There we go. And for our x value, we're just going to be getting our movement variable. So we've determined it, we've set it already, and now we're just calling this value back. Okay, so this is setting our velocity, or essentially our speed of our enemy character. All right, and the final thing we want to do is set up our animations. Now, our enemy isn't quite as animated as our player. They are just walking or idle animations, but they are hingent or reliant on the movement variable, or actually the speed variable to be exact. So we're going to look for an animator, and we're going to set float. We're going to use a name and value. And for the name, we're going to be looking for a speed variable. And the value will be absolute movement speed, or movement value. So get variable again. And that's going to be our graph, and that's going to be movement. Okay, so we have set up essentially the movement for our enemy. So I'm going to type in just the animation here. Okay, so now with this, what we can do is start setting this up and start getting ready to kind of set up our enemy walk. What we'll first do, though, is create a second script before attaching these all in. So I'm going to go back to my macros, and now we want our enemy to be able to walk, but we also want them to not fall off of the platform. So to do that, what we'll do is create a second script, and we'll call it enemy reach edge. And let's see, this is all part of our patrol kind of mechanic and structure. So what I'll actually do is, before I create that script, I'm getting maybe a little ahead of myself. I'm going to select my enemy. I am going to go back to my state graph here. Inside my alive, I'm going to set up my patrol mechanics first. So I'm going to just maximize it. So I'm going to open up patrol, and right now I have a start phase, or a start pose, or start state. Now I don't want to keep this as start, and I'm going to rename this. I'm actually going to rename this idle. So we'll have an idle pose or an idle state in our patrol. We will have I will create I believe it's a script graph, and we'll name this one walk left. So our enemy will walk left, or the enemy will walk right. So all I'm going to do is copy and paste this. So Control C and Control V, copy and paste this node. And I'm going to name it instead walk right. I'm going to set this up kind of in a little triangle here. And what I'm going to do is go into this state, and I'm going to delete all of these nodes that are in here. So start, update, and on exit. And what I'm going to do instead is right click and type in enemy walk for the machine state graph that I already created. And you'll see that it drops it right in there. For my idle, I'm going to leave this direction value for 0. I'm going to go back to patrol. I'm going to do the same thing with walk left and walk right. So I'm going to open up walk left. I'm going to delete these 3 nodes. And I'm going to right click and type in enemy walk. Remember, this is the script that I just created. And in this case, I'm going to give the direction a value of -1 because we are walking left. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing one more time for my walk right. So I'm going to open this up, delete these 3 states, right click, type in enemy walk, and add in my new script. And for the direction of walk right, we're going to add a +1 value. So now I'm going to go back to my patrol state, and I still have idle as in green, and my walk left and walk right are still grayed out. But if I click in these, I should have my kind of subgraph there for enemy walk. Perfect. Okay, so next thing I'm going to want to do is create some transitions. And before I start creating my transitions, here is where I'm going to make another script that we'll use to determine the enemy making these transitions. So our enemy will change their mind at a random time interval when they're walking. So they might be idle, they might be walking left, or they might be walking right, and they'll change their mind and move to another state. So we'll have kind of like a little triangle here moving between each one of these 3 states. But before we set that up, I'm going to go to project, and this is where I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to call this, I'm going to right click, hit create, visual scripting, and it's going to be a script graph. And I'm going to call this enemy change mind. Okay, so this will be a really pretty straightforward script. I'm going to open it up. It should be blank. And what I'm going to do is right click, and I'm going to look for on interstate. And from here, I'm going to go to wait for seconds. And I'm going to choose my delay, and I'm going to create this a random range of time. So I'm going to do random range, and there's 2 that you can choose from. I'm going to use min inclusive and max exclusive. Okay, and the minimum is going to be 1, and the maximum is going to be 3. So this will range between 1 to 3 seconds that will wait, and there will be a shift in transitioning to a new phase or new state. So from here, I'm going to go to trigger transition, and it's going to be a state trigger. So what this is effectively going to do is it's going to say, hey, whenever you come to this state, whatever this current state is, we're going to wait for between 1 and 3 seconds, and then we're going to send you to another state. We're going to move to another phase. Now, to make sure this works, there's one last thing you have to do. Hit on your on trigger state. And if you look in your graph inspector, there's a box up here that says coroutine, and we need to check that. Once you check that, you'll notice that the icon for the node turns into these 2 green arrows pointing right. So once you've done that, you're all good to go. And what we can do, I'm going to go back to my project. There I have my scripts. So I'm going to select my enemy. I'm going to go to the enemy state graph. I'll maximize this, go to alive, go to patrol. And from here, what I'm going to do is right click on idle, make a transition, and I'm going to transition to walk left. And I'm going to go from walk left, transition to idle. I'm going to do this between idle and walk right, and then between walk right and walk left. So we're just adding transitions from each one to the other. And there we go. So now that I have my transitions made, I have one more thing that I need to do to set this up. I'm going to click on each node in my transitions, and notice how I can create individual graphs that correspond to criteria or parameters for these transitions. Now, because I already have that enemy change mind script, all I have to do is go into the graph inspector up here where it says source embedded. I'm going to drop this down and choose graph. It'll ask me if I want to delete embed graph. I'm going to hit switch, so I'm going to hit enter. And now I have this option to put a graph in there. So I'm going to hit this circle, and I'm going to look for enemy change mind. And now I'm going to do this for every transition. This might take a few seconds. Okay, and nearly done. Okay, there we go. So now my character should be walking, but I think I might have some problems. And I'm not going to test this out just yet because I know that I'm going to have some problems. We need to add a ground check for our enemy. So just like our player, when they jump, our character is no longer touching the ground, and we make use of the animations for that. So whenever the character is in air, they are jumping, and whenever they are in air, they can also not jump again. So we want to make sure that the enemy, for one, does not ever walk off a ledge, and this is part of that enemy change mind. But we also just want to make sure that the ground check, whenever we do go to set it up, is set up that we can adjust it for the enemy character, because the enemy character is not as tall as our character player. So we'll need to adjust our ground check for that. So what I'm going to do, and I know this might seem like a little bit of a divergence, I'm going to project. I'm going to go to my ground check, and I'm going to open this up. Now, I don't need to make major changes to this, but there are a few little things that I can add in here to make it more customizable. So I'm going to open up my ground check. And what I'm going to do is, actually, we already have an output here, so I'm going to add an input. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to type in input. I'm going to click this input icon. It's a green arrow pointing into a square. And again, just like what we ran into earlier, I'm not able to add any hooks in here. So to create these hooks, what I have to do is go into my data inputs. I'll hit this plus sign, and I want to create 3 data inputs. One is going to be called offset. Hit enter this time, so it saves the name. The type of my offset is going to be a vector2, and it's going to have a default value of 0, 0. Okay, and we notice how when I add that, you'll see this little offset hook now in my input node. Now I have 2 more values to add. The next one is going to be radius. And this is going to be of type, I believe it's a float. Yes. And this has a default value of 3. Oops, there we go. And finally, we have one last variable, or one last data input. And this is going to be called direction. And this has this is a type float. And it has a default value of 1.1. There we go. Okay, so I'll click over here just to finish this off. And now I just want to double check and make sure these are all looking good. I have my 3 values here: offset, radius, and direction. They are showing up on my input value here, so I'm good to go. So what I'm going to do, and what allows this to be more modular and usable with our enemy and our player, is by creating these value hooks in our input. So now what I'm going to do is take my radius, send this to my radius for my circle cast, and do the same thing for direction. And actually, I think I should have named this distance. Sorry. This should be distance. There we go. Oh, no. There you go. So since I renamed it, it no longer showed up, and it was hooked up, so it was kind of screaming at me. Okay, so now there's one more thing we need to do. Between this get position, we're actually going to add 2 extra inputs, or 1 input. So what I'm going to do is go from get position to add, and I'm going to make sure you add vector3, because if you just use math generic or vector2, it won't quite work. So make sure you're adding a vector3. And we're going to send this to the origin of our circle cast. And now for our second value, we're going to go to the offset. They're effectively just offsetting the start of this ground check. Okay, so now with these additions, we should be able to make better use of our ground check and make it more optimized, and so that we're not repeating ourselves with our enemy. So what I want to do first is select my player and make sure that any changes that have been made to my ground check are still correct for the player. So I'm going to open this up. We'll go over to our ground check over here. All right, my radius is 3. My distance is 1.1. Now, I'm pretty sure my radius should be 0.3, so that might have been a mistake on my part. So I'm going to double click my ground check, and let's change this value to 0.3. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my player. Let's change this to 0.3 as well. Okay, and let's check. I believe there's another ground check in here somewhere. Yep, here we go. I'm just change these to 0.3. Okay, and I think that should be good. Let me double check, and then we'll see about our enemy. Okay. Okay. All right. So from here, we should be good. Did I miss anything? No. Okay. So from here, what we're going to do is add a new script graph, and this is going to be where our enemy is checking the edge. So right now, our enemy is, it's possible for our enemy to walk off the edge of any platforms. So we're going to make one more new script. I'm going to go to project. I'm going to right click in here in my macros. Sorry. I'm going to right click, hit create, and visual scripting and script graph. And we're going to call this enemy reach edge. And I'm going to edit this graph. Okay, so I'm going to open this up, max size. What we're going to do is first, we're going to create an offset. And what this offset will be used is it will read shortly in front, or a short distance in front of our enemy, to check if there's an edge coming up. And then we'll determine if the character is not grounded or not. So what we'll do is first use a transform get local scale. And we'll send this to our vector2 for get x. And then we're going to multiply this. I'm just using the generic. And we're going to multiply this by a float literal of 0.5. This is 0.5 pixels in front, or like 0.5 distance in front of the character. This is a really, really small distance ahead. And so it will visually or perceptually seem like the player, like the enemy is right there on the edge. And we're going to add this to a vector2 create for the x value. So this is where we are checking and creating a forward offset. Forward offset creation, we'll just call it that. And then with this offset value, what we're going to use is check our ground check. We'll be pulling up our ground check. We'll be sending this to an if statement. And we'll be checking if false to trigger a transition. And in this case, we'll eventually be triggering this shortly here. We'll trigger this that if the enemy is moving left and we notice that there is they won't be grounded, then they will immediately turn right. And we'll check this on update. And we're actually going to be using an on late update for this, because we want this to be checked and then immediately, like, checked after every other action that has happened. So we want our character to move first and then check this to see if they're about to fall off the edge. So make sure you're using that late update. And then I'm going to call this branch if not grounded. So essentially move or change triggers or change transitions if not grounded. Okay, so that is it for our enemy reach edge. now we are going to add that into our enemy patrol transition. So I'm going to click on my enemy, open up the graph. I'm going to hit alive and patrol. And now I'm going to add 2 more transitions between walk right and walk left. I'm going to add one from each to the other. And just like we did with the enemy change mind, I'm going to go through here, go from embedded to graph, and I'm going to add in the enemy change mind, or enemy reach edge, sorry. There you go. I'm going to do that for both of these transitions. Reach edge, there we go. And so you now should see that you have 2 of these like upside down U looking transitions and 2 of these like circular transitions. So these are just showing kind of like how these transitions are set up. We're using an on update loop on this one, and on these are more of a on enter state. Okay, so that should be good. Now, the last thing I believe is, oh, I know exactly what I need to do. We're going to go back into that transition, and we're going to change our radius or our ground check values for our enemy. Remember, I was saying that our enemy is going to be a different size, so we need a different ground check. This default value ground check is built for our player character. So our radius for our enemy is actually going to be 0.1. And the distance is only going to be 1. All right, so I added that on one transition right here. I need to add that for both transitions. It looks like it's right there. Okay, so that's good. Okay, so we should be good. Now I'm just going to double check my player's ground check, and it's still 0.3 and 1.1. And remember, the enemy should be 0.1 and 1. Okay, cool. So we're all good. All right, now the last thing we're going to want to do is set up the enemy chase state. So this is where whenever the player gets a certain distance to the enemy, the enemy will start chasing them. And whenever the player gets a certain distance away from the enemy, then the enemy will lose interest and go back to patrolling. So what I'm going to do is start with my enemy selected. I'm going to go up to my main kind of state, open up alive, and now we're going to go to the chase state. I can delete all 3 of these events because I don't need them. And I'm going to start with a get variable. And this is going to be an application variable, and we'll be looking for the player. And we're going to get the player's position. And what we're essentially checking is we're looking at the distance between the player and the enemy, and we're trying to close in that gap. So we're subtracting the player's distance or the player's current position from the enemy's position and finding the X value in there. And that's going to be the direction that the enemy needs to head. So I'm going to copy and paste this get position node, and we're going to use a subtract. And we're going to subtract. You can just use the regular kind of generic math subtract for this one. We're going to be taking the player's position, subtracting it from the enemy's position, creating a vector2 X value, or getting the X value, and then creating a direction from this. So we're actually going to call in our enemy walk, and this will define our direction value there. And that's all we have to enter for our chase state. Now, if I go back to alive, you'll see that these transitions are still not quite working right? They're not lit up, and our chase state is not lit up as well. So there's a couple other things we need to do to get this all set up, right? We need to set up our transitions. We need to create a variable called detection as well. And what this variable will do, it will be a number, and it will be a distance essentially from the enemy. And if the player is within this detection range, then we will enter the chase phase. So what I'm going to do is, because I have the enemy selected, I have this object window available. So I'm going to create an object variable. I'm going to call this detection. I'm going to hit enter. And this is going to be a float. And it is going to have a value of 3. So if the player is within 3 units of the enemy or within 3 3 units, then the enemy will start chasing. So now what we need to do is go into our transition. I'm going to hit Edit Graph, and we don't necessarily need to create new graphs for these because this is the only time we'll use these graphs. This is really just going from the kind of patrolling to chase phase, and these are pretty small graphs. So what we'll first do is we'll calculate the player distance. So how far is the player? So I'm going to add a node. We'll call it transform, get position. So this is for the enemy. I'm going to copy and paste this, and then we'll get another one, and we're going to find with tag. So we're going to look for a game object with a tag called player. So we're getting the player's position, and then we're going to create or use a vector2 distance, and it will determine the distance between these two. There we go. And so this is effectively calculating player distance. This will be important later because we can copy and paste this whole segment instead of making it from scratch again. Now, what do we want to do when we find out the player distance? Well, if the player distance is less, in which case this is the case because I want to go back. I am in the transition from patrol to chase. So make sure you're in that one. These are each going to be their own individual script. There will be similarities, but they are going to be different. So in the transition from patrol to chase, I'm going to use this less value. So if this distance is less than, I'm going to get an object variable. I'm going to call it detection. So if this is less than my detection variable, so if this distance is less than 3, then we're going to go into the chase state, right? If true, then trigger transition. And again, this transition will trigger to our chase. And we want this to happen on update. So every kind of tick of our game or every kind of every frame. Now, I will be doing this a little bit differently for the next transition, but like I said earlier, I can use this section. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to hit Control-C, Command-C on a Mac to copy. Go back to Alive. Notice how now my transition is lit up. I'm going to go into this other transition from chase to patrol, and I'm going to paste. So Control-V, Command-V in a Mac. There we go. Make sure you click in this window or else it won't paste. Okay, so from here, what I'm going to be doing is looking for the same value, and I have, determined my player distance here. So we're going to say if this value is greater or equal to my detection. So get variable, and this is going to be an object, and this is my detection. So if this value is greater than 3 or equal to 3, then we're going to change into the next transition. And this is going to happen on update. And remember, my transition from here, I'm moving from chase to patrol. So if my player makes it 3 distances or 3 units away from the enemy or further, then my enemy will disengage and just go about patrolling. So now if I go to my live state, we see that I have my chase and my patrol all working. So now let's play through here and make sure it works. All right, so let's watch our enemy and see if he patrols around. It looks like he does. Can he hit an edge? All right, he hits that edge and he doesn't fall off. Perfect. Now let's see if he chases me. Oh, he's chasing. He's chasing. Okay. He is very interested. Oh, I got hit. All right, so let's see what happens. All right, so he's disengaged. Gotten away from him. He'll hit that edge. This is perfect. This is perfect. Let's see what happens. Will he come over and follow me? Oh, so this is going to be a problem. We don't want our enemy chasing us off of a platform. We want our enemy to stay on a platform. So we've got it set up inside the patrol state, but it's currently not set up for our chase state, for our enemy to stay on the platform that they're on. We can quickly remedy this because we already set up that enemy reach edge script and we've used it in the patrol. All we have to do is choose chase state. I'm going to right click, make a transition, and transition to patrol. And for this script, I'm not going to embed. I'm going to use a graph. I'm going to hit enter. And this graph is going to be my enemy reach edge graph. Now, with this third transition going from chase to patrol, our enemy should remain on whatever platform they're on and not follow the player off a platform. Let's see if this works. Okay, so our enemy is running around. Let's see, will they chase me? They will not chase me off the edge. Oh, but I can fall off the platform. Let's double check and make sure this works. Oh, he's chasing me now. Okay, so now our enemy is on the edge and not falling off. So that's it pretty much for the enemy tutorial. Now, there will be some sections that we'll fill out, like the death state later, but that is going to be in the next video when we look at projectiles. So that's all for now. Again, take your time with this. This will take a while, but just go slow and double check everything you're doing with the graphs that I've shown you. Good luck.